Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'll make this brief because I'm just now processing this news that has come in about Egypt. What I can say right off the bat is prepare for the possibility of another revolution, and certainly political and social unrest, civil unrest, strife in Egypt over the coming 2023. Let me go back into history a little bit. One of the reasons that the coup of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi took place against Mohamed Morsi in the first place was because Mohamed Morsi had negotiations with the IMF about loan agreements, but he was hesitant to implement the structural adjustment reforms requested or demanded by the IMF at that time, saying, I can't do that now, I just came into power, I need more time. They weren't satisfied with his reluctance. Now, the military knew that. The military could see the writing on the wall and knew that multinational corporations and foreign investors were going to have their way with Egypt. The military has the strongest and largest stake in the economy of Egypt. So if they had allowed Morsi to capitulate to the IMF reforms, which he probably would have, their stake in the economy would have been vulnerable. Because the Muslim Brotherhood also has a fairly large business network, and they practice nepotism. So if the IMF reforms had been implemented, the Muslim Brotherhood would have benefited from that, their group would have benefited from that, their businesses would have benefited from that, and the military would have potentially lost some of their holdings and their stake in the Egyptian economy. So they overthrew Mohamed Morsi, and they imposed the IMF reforms as requested, as demanded, and as predicted by myself all those years back. The Egyptian economy has suffered catastrophically in the intervening period. Now, because the Egyptian economy is in such a catastrophic state, and with the added crises that were caused by the Western proxy war against Europe, i.e. the sanctions against Russia, we have an energy crisis, we have a food crisis, we have food shortages, we have inflation. Food inflation in Egypt is skyrocketed. The currency has plummeted. So you have severe economic crisis in Egypt right now. This has caused them to go again to the IMF. They've been going to the IMF ever since 2015, 2016, when they got the biggest loan ever that the IMF has ever given to the Middle East, to a Middle Eastern country. At which point, I wrote Egypt off, I'm afraid. There was nothing else that I could say about Egypt because the country had already surrendered its sovereignty to the IMF, i.e. to the owners and controllers of global financialized capital. Now, the situation has reached critical mass, and they've gone to the IMF again, and they are now going to capitulate in order to receive more aid from the IMF. They're going to capitulate to further structural adjustment reforms, which will include shrinking the military's stake in the economy. In other words, the advantages that the military, the Egyptian army, has in the economic sector, in the private sector, will be diminished so that there can be, so as they call it, a level playing field with multinational corporations who have a budget greater than the GDP of Egypt. That's level playing field. The point is that now the IMF is going to force Sisi to capitulate to demands that will diminish the military's stake in the economy, which is precisely why, or one of the reasons anyway, why they carried out the coup to begin with, so that they can protect their holdings in the Egyptian economy. Now they're going to have to sacrifice them anyway, a decade later, after a decade of catastrophe on the Egyptian economy. Now Sisi is going to have to sacrifice those holdings and that stake in the economy anyway. The question is, will the military accept this? Because this makes Sisi superfluous. He's redundant now. If he does this, he's redundant. His job within the dynamics of Egypt was to protect the interests of the military in the economy. Now he's going to have to sacrifice those. He is making himself redundant by doing this. So there's the potential of another coup, And there's certainly the potential of another revolution when you see the economic crisis at the level it is now, which is greater than it was in 2012, 2013. The situation, the price of bread, the currency devaluation is catastrophic. As I said, I'm just getting this news. So inshallah, I will do another video or probably a series of videos as events unfold in Egypt. But I would expect that 2023 is going to be a fairly explosive year for our brothers and sisters in Egypt. Jazakumullahu khairan wa assalamu alaikum.